This is EWA Radio, the official podcast of the Education Writers Association, and I'm public editor Emily Richmond. Home economics has always been about more than learning to sew on buttons or bake wobbly cakes, even if we didn't know it. In her new book, longtime education journalist Danielle Dreilinger digs into the secret history behind this long maligned field and puts a fascinating spotlight on how home economists shaped and informed generations of family lives and domestic work. She also looks at the influence of home ec on public education, as well as its complicated place in the battle for gender and racial equality. She joins us now. Danielle, welcome back to EWA Radio.
Thanks for having me.
There are a lot of surprises in this book, and one of them, I think, for a lot of people is how large a field home economics was and is, and how many different facets of daily life it touches on beyond what you describe as that stereotypical stitching and stirring. What drew you to this subject?
It did not come out of any reporting that I was doing for the job I had at the time covering New Orleans and Louisiana education for the Times-Picayune. I had not covered home economics at all. The closest I had come was vocational culinary classes and the Edible Schoolyard Project, which are both part of home economics, but it was never spoken about that way. Instead, I was really coming at it from the other direction, which was just thinking about an idea for a book, because I had wanted to write a book and had one idea, which you guys can hear. I'm going to give this idea away because I'm decided not to do it, which was a history of school discipline and punishment. And I just felt like it wasn't the greatest book for me to do. So I was thinking, what's a book topic that could embrace education and race, gender, and class and history? And I thought cooking, because that's one of my, it's not even hobbies, just something I do a lot. And I wanted this book idea to touch on my personal life. And when I put that all together, I thought, home economics, the class that taught girls how to cook, because that's what I thought it was too. And immediately I thought, shouldn't this be back by now? Because I thought about all of the trends in our society, which include, the excitement over HGTV and farm-to-table cooking and the fears about adulting. And on the education beat side, the return of career technical education and the pushback against standardized testing. So already it seemed really relevant. And then when I started doing some research, the very first thing I learned was that the first woman, one of the founders of home economics, was the first woman to go to MIT, which immediately made me realize that there was so much more here than I knew or that I had ever learned about as a reporter.
So that woman was Ellen Swallow Richards, and she wanted to be a chemist, right? But that path was closed to her.
It was closed to her, but she found a way. She was one of the first women to go to Vassar, which was just opening at the time. She went in her mid-20s because colleges that took women when she was born. Then she wanted more education. There was no way to do it. And a firm of commercial chemists that she wrote to suggested that she apply to MIT, which was very new itself and did not take women. But she gave it a shot anyway and got lucky that the president of the college believed in coeducation and he made it possible for her to go there. At first, she was really just auditing. They did eventually give her a degree, but she was an unofficial, a special student, and she wasn't paying anything. And from there on, she went on to do a great amount of work before she began the domestic home economics work to open up chemistry to women at MIT and elsewhere. A school superintendent came into her lab and said, what good do you think that will do women in the kitchen? And he meant it as an insult, but she thought about it. She thought, what good will this do women in the kitchen? She saw that there was a whole world of science that could be brought into the home to make people's lives better.
And we're talking, of course, about, she graduated from MIT in 1873, and this was a rapid time of progress and change and industrialization happening in society. And so she was asking questions like, why aren't we trying to make some of the lives easier for the people putting in 100 hours of unpaid work a week?
When I got onto the education beat, and I think this is typical of a lot of people, I just dove into what I needed to know to cover what I was covering at the time. So I looked at a lot of history about education in New Orleans. I didn't ever look at the history of education proper, honestly, until I started working on this book, which is when I found out how few people went to school formally in the middle of the 19th century, and then how much that world transformed after the Civil War when people began opening colleges and then preparatory institutions to get to them for for African Americans and for women and for fledgling scientists, and really expanded education beyond the elite white male province that it had been until then. And of course, I mean, people who were enslaved, most could not be taught to read even before the Civil War. So this was a time of great change in society, and also a great expansion in education that I honestly just never knew about when I was doing daily beat reporting.
You also pay close attention to the contributions to the field of home economics by women of color, particularly African American women. I remember learning, of course, about Booker T. Washington in school, but I definitely did not know about his wife. Tell us a little bit about Margaret Murray Washington.
Margaret Murray Washington was an extraordinary woman. When she died in 1925, the president sent a telegram. She was born right at the end of the Civil War. It's a little unclear, in Mississippi, and she was an incredibly smart young girl. And she was taken under the wing of a white brother and sister who had moved to town to help Black children become educated. And they sent her to Fisk College in Nashville, and she worked her way through, earned a bachelor's degree, got a job teaching at Tuskegee, eventually married Booker T. Washington. And she had started as an English professor, but rapidly became the dean of women and in charge of their domestic economy, domestic science program, which was what home economics was called at the time. And Margaret Murray Washington saw the potential for a better home life to transform Black Americans. She really focused on the low-income former slaves living on plantations near Tuskegee. She did an extraordinary amount of community education and advocacy. And she saw herself as, working hand in hand with her husband to bring economic power and a better life to poor Black families. And she genuinely believed that if people could live in a more respectable way, middle-class respectable way, that it would bring them self-respect, that would lead to more respect by whites. And, even if whites never came around, that it would just be enormously powerful and empowering for those families. I mean, having self-respect as a Black sharecropper in Alabama at the time was a political statement in and of itself. I mean, she met the Queen of England. She traveled all around the world giving speeches, teaching, for years on end. She was incredibly influential.
What I love is there's a detail in your book about how she survived her husband and she used his leftover stationery and just added misses to the return address. I love that detail, Danielle.
Home economists are really thrifty. They don't like to waste things.
That's absolutely right. Well, there's obviously a lot of complicated history here as well in terms of what was in this curriculum, in these textbooks, in the message that home economists were sending. And you really do get into that, into some of the complicated messaging. And some of it was derogatory to people who were not white or from that traditional Christian upbringing. Can you talk a little bit about that?
The project of home economics was twofold. It was to bring freedom to people who were taking care of houses, make their life in the home easier so that they could do things out in the world. And it was also to create this range of careers and educational opportunities for women that men would accept because they were rooted in these tasks from the home. So hotel management, for instance, dietetic. And they were remarkably successful in creating this field from, whole cloth, really, and creating these educational homes of their own in universities. The vast majority of women professors in universities for decades were in the home economics school. In order to do this, they had to partner with men who were in charge of K-12 education, many of whom thought that home economics was a great topic for women to study, especially women of color, because their place was in the home. A lot of the white home economists who were in charge of the field, they went along with racism and various forms of oppression for decades. Women of color were always central to home economics, but also marginalized. So the American Home Economics Association was segregated in its southern chapter for decades until the 1960s civil rights movement. And in fact, until the federal government began getting involved, threatening to cut off funding. So you do see these, really horrible textbooks and journal articles in the 1910s and 1920s and beyond that talk about how you could use home economics to Americanize immigrants, with these derogatory statements about Native Americans, about Latinos. Latinas were put in segregated classes in Southern California that were heavy on the home economics because they were going to be the white superintendent thought like maids or mothers. So, why educate them? And this was, sadly, this was precisely what home economists were fighting against generally, because they were trying to say that all of these professions and that work in the home in general were to be respected, were intellectually stimulating, were, a good use of time. And they were sort of trying to have it both ways, and it ended up really painted in the corner in the end.
One of the legacies of home economics is in pretty much every school today, at least the ones that we know about, and that is school lunch. Tell us about that.
School lunch was a home economics project from way back because it just solved a lot of problems at once. So city schools were often built without kitchens, country schools too, because in the country, kids brought their lunch. In the city, kids would go home or they would get lunch from, what we would now call today food carts, really. A lot of kids were hungry. I mean, child poverty, child hunger have been a problem in America for a long, long time. So home economists saw this as a way to feed children so that they could be more alert in school and pay attention. They also saw it as a way to teach nutritional principles and to, at times, teach the work of catering, of food management, restaurant management that were, careers that home economics embraced and furthered. So from Ellen Swallow Richards early on created a pilot school lunch program in Boston, but they didn't really get started on a large scale until the Great Depression, when at the same time that they were trying to feed more kids, the agriculture industry was in crisis, and they ended up at one point with surplus commodities. And so the federal government, with a lot of pressure from the agriculture lobby and from home economists, created a program where they would buy commodities from farmers and then serve them to children in the schools. And they employed unemployed mothers and other adults to cook the food in the cafeteria. So it was a win all around. And that's where school lunch got started. And that is why, to this day, it is tied in with agriculture commodities.
We're talking with Danielle Dreilinger about her new book, The Secret History of Home Economics. Don't miss an episode of EWA Radio. You never have to. You can find us on your favorite podcast app. And thank you to everyone who has taken a moment to rate us on iTunes. Your support and your feedback are helping us to grow. So Danielle, another kind of big surprise in this book is, I knew about students having to carry around bags of flour as practice babies to practice their parenting skills. What I didn't know is that some colleges had actual practice babies.
The practice babies are a real eyebrow raiser. So colleges and even some high schools by the 1920s had these home management houses or apartments, and they were like a living home economics lab. So when you were a senior in your home economics program, you would go live at the home economics house for, some period of time. And the women, they were almost always women, would work together to just run the house. And the idea was you were bringing everything you had learned together. So somebody figured out what's missing in this house? Oh, right, children. And colleges began bringing in actual babies, human babies, usually from orphanages, to live at the home management house for a semester or a year, and they would be part of the curriculum. So the students would take care of the baby, would feed them, would take lots of measurements. It was all very scientific to see how much weight the babies were gaining. The press coverage is effusive. The students would make scrapbooks for the babies to remember them by. This was the era of closed adoption. So once babies were adopted, nobody would ever know what became of them. And their babies were very popular among adoptive parents. They'd just been taken care of really well as one baby in a household, as opposed to orphanages, right, where you would have the opposite staffing ratio. This is a field that we think of as promoting women being barefoot and pregnant and heterosexual nuclear families and all of that. But in reality, there is just so much else going on with family structure. Because when you think about it, this is a group of women coming together as a temporary family to take care of a baby. This is not actually teaching you how to be a stay-at-home mother. This is one of the researchers I read called it really something like a feminist commune. Picayune.
Well, let's jump a little bit ahead then to, the feminist movement. And let's talk a little bit about why 1970 was such a pivotal year for the home economics group.
In home economics, there was always this tension between whether it was liberating or whether it was repressive. And the home economists thought that they were promoting liberation, and they did not realize, like after World War II, when there was so much repression of women and so much repression of working women, they didn't recognize the ways in which they had become basically tools of the patriarchy. They had shifted to a time from where girls who were ambitious would go into home economics in college because that was how they could get a job, to a point where ambitious women were being told, oh, you shouldn't take chemistry, you should just take home economics. But the second wave feminist movement was incredibly aware of all of the ways that home economics was now repressive. And Robin Morgan, who had edited the first big second wave feminist anthology, Sisterhood is Powerful, the Home Ec Association invited her to come in 1971 and talk about women's roles. And she just laid into them. I wish I could have quoted her entire speech, but she told them that they were tools of the patriarchy and that they should quit their jobs. And this was this earthquake in the field. And to home economists' credit, they really took the criticism and embraced it and ran with it. And they said, wait a second, we thought we were teaching liberation, but we've been turned around the wrong direction. Let's change. I mean, they reviewed the curriculum to see how it supported gender stereotypes. They rewrote it. They supported the Equal Rights Amendment. They began writing articles in which they said any family structure was fine. You don't have to have a straight married couple. They analyzed their curriculum to see how it supported gender stereotype. They supported the Equal Rights Amendment. And they wrote articles saying that any kind of family was fine.
The field of home economics tried very hard to evolve. What's the state of home economics right now in K-12 public schools?
It is still there, but it is hidden and it is really struggling. So home economics changed its name back in the early 90s in a bid to get beyond the stereotypes of stitching and stirring. So many places now will call it family and consumer sciences, but not everywhere. The class might be called life and careers. It encompasses a lot of career tech classes, such as culinary education, and it's part of the CTE sector. It's still supported by the Perkins Act, for everybody who's covered the Perkins Act, and they're really clinging to keep that position in the career tech world. That's where a bunch of their status comes from. From No Child Left Behind and from A Nation at Risk in the 80s, there's just been this long-standing pressure where you have schools laying on the academics and cutting out life skills. So much of the infrastructure around home economics has withered away that I couldn't actually find out how many kids are taking the class now. And the big researcher on this tried to update her stats and wasn't able to. As of about 10 years ago, there were still 3.3 million public K-12 students in the US taking home economics each year. Some of those stats don't cover middle school. The people at the state level who kept track of these numbers, those jobs don't exist anymore. So when I looked at the Louisiana list of FCS courses, it didn't include all sorts of classes that I knew existed. Or these classes might exist, but they are taught by somebody who isn't qualified to teach them, which causes a lot of problems in the curriculum. And, there's still this enormous demand for home economics teachers. I'm on some Facebook groups, and they're constantly posting job listings. In some cases, school districts are saying, if we can't find somebody to take this job, we're just going to end the course altogether. So it's definitely in, a muddle right now, which is why I hadn't heard of it when I was doing beat reporting, even though it is so relevant and so interesting now.
You're a longtime education journalist. You've worked everywhere from public radio station in Boston to, as you mentioned, the Times-Picayune in New Orleans. You've also reported nationally for outlets like the Hechinger Report. You are not, however, a historian. So I'm curious, how did you get comfortable with writing for that mindset for what is essentially a social history book?
No one ever really told me I wasn't a historian. I kind of forgot. One thing is I read a lot of history. I never went to journalism school either. So when I started writing feature stories approximately a gajillion years ago, I just read so many feature stories that I had in my bones what they should look like. And I bought a couple of books on writing biography. I think I read one of them, maybe. But I just took the same set of skills that I use as a journalist and I applied them to material from the past. I was asking the same questions. It's just instead of asking people, school, I was asking articles and data. I always did a lot of data reporting anyway. And, education reporters, like, we do data, we look at policy papers, we sometimes read people's dissertations. Like, it's the same kind of documents. They're just documents in history instead of documents now. And I, of course, also, I did things that historians don't always do, such as interviewing people who are alive now about the people who they knew and, interviewing them in that feature reporter way. I knew I had to have strong characters, and I knew I needed to find a way to bring them to life for the reader. So things like, I was asking people, like, how tall was she? What was her voice like? What did she wear? Nobody asks these questions. Unfortunately, that's not mostly in the documents of the past, right? But that's how I got someone telling me that, Luzanne Mamer, who was a home economist with the Rural Electrification Administration, in her 70s, at the end of her career, that she would just stride down like the marble halls of this federal building in her high heels, and you could hear her like down the hallway. So don't be afraid of doing history. It's the same skill set of being a journalist. You're just mostly looking at papers instead of talking to people.
Your book got a tremendous write-up in the New Yorker magazine, and staff writer Margaret Talbot called it deeply researched and crisply written. And I'm just wondering, at what point did your head explode?
Oh my God, immediately.
For reporters who may be out there and are thinking about something like this, I'm curious, how do you write a book and earn a living at the same time?
It has been a challenge. I wasn't able to do a beat reporting job while writing this book. Some of the big advice I have for people is like, get fellowships, apply for fellowships. And this is a long-term project. Like, I knew I wanted to write a book. I knew that it would be important for me to have a fellowship like Knight Wallace, which is why I got. I purposely worked on creating a portfolio of ambitious stories that will make me qualified for the bigger fellowship. I'm happy to talk to people if they want to get in touch with me, but there's like a network of fellowships, the EWA Reporting Fellowship, for instance, that can just help you put together the money and, be freelancing. When you sell the book, you do get an advance, but it rarely is enough to live on while you do the book. So, I was freelancing part-time while I was working on the book. At one point, I had a part-time restaurant job.
Well, we're very proud to claim you, Danielle, as a member of the inaugural class of EWA Reporting Fellows back in 2016.
And that was one of the projects that I used. It was a project that I really cared about, which was about what happened to the first set of New Orleans KIPP High School graduates in college. It also was definitely something that I was looking at as a portfolio piece to help me eventually get a book deal.
There are not a lot of stories about home economics right now in the news cycle, and I think you've made a pretty big case that these classes are out there and they're having an impact, and we should be paying attention. So I'm going to hand you the desk editor hat and ask you to go ahead and assign the education reporters who are listening a couple of story ideas you'd like to see them do around this topic.
Thinking about quick hits, are these classes happening? Are there teacher opening? There's like a policy question about how family consumer sciences is trying to make itself more relevant within like the career tech framework. I went to the Family, Career, and Community Leaders of America State Conference. Just going to one of their meetings and seeing the projects that the kids are working on is really inspiring and really exciting because they get engaged with social issues and community service, and they put together projects to try and make their communities better, where they're also learning various home economic skills, such as, interior design and early childhood education. And another classroom story. So I write about this woman in Virginia, Angela DeHart, who just is the most amazing home economics teacher. And she's now actually retired, largely out of frustration. If you can find one of the innovative teachers, pretty much all the states have Family and Consumer Sciences Teachers Association, like ask them for somebody amazing and go check out their class. Those are really great classes to profile. Like they're really inspiring.
Danielle Dreilinger is the author of The Secret History of Home Economics and a longtime member of the Education Writers Association. Danielle, thank you for making time for EWA Radio.
Thank you.
And that wraps up another episode for us. If there's a story you want to learn more about, drop us a line with radio@ewa.org. The mission of the Education Writers Association is to strengthen the community of education journalists and improve the quality of education coverage. For more than 70 years, EWA has helped reporters get the story right. Have a great week, take care of yourselves, and thank you for listening.